All right. All right. So today's we're in First Corinthians. We're finishing up chapter 7. We'll talk again about the next week more towards the end. But we come now to this fourth section of First Corinthians 7. The section begins with the phrase concerning virgins. And this phrase idea of now concerning, as I've remarked in the past, marks a linguistic outline. You've seen this the second time now. And what it remarks is that Paul seems to be answering questions specifically that have been put to him. For instance, 1 Corinthians 7:1 begins, now concerning, and it's a lead to something that was on the Corinthians' mind. And it seems as if the question or concern was brought up in the letter. And the same goes for here. But before we begin, what I want to do is highlight how the commentators that I've read, none of them agreed, which always leaves you with a little bit of unsettledness as you start to say, well, what does this mean? I mean, it's one thing to say what it says, and one thing what it means. And this is where last message becomes so important. We're going to run across the phrase present distress. And when you think present distress, think about the message that Bob just gave about the difficulties that Christians had in the first century with persecution and trial and wondering what tomorrow was going to be like, let alone your life as a new married person, because you're now unmarried. If you can begin to understand that, I think you can begin to understand kind of what the Corinthians were going through. Now, as much as I can make sense, that's what the passage means. It's quarter after, I think we're done. Let's close in prayer. What all the commentators do note is that the interpretations really depend on verses 36 to 38, which is towards the end, right? So like you got to hang on and wait for a while, and we'll get there eventually. None of the interpretations is without their difficulties. It's not like anyone's a slam dunk. So our task is to look at the words and the phrases, to follow the arguments, to see if we can come up with something we can understand and live with. So by way of kind of recalling, again, today's agenda. Okay. So we're going to look at the counsel for single adults, which is verses 25 to 38, and then counsel for the Christian widows, which is the last two verses. And within that single adults, he's saying to stay unmarried because of the present crisis, because of the end of the world, because of the distractions of married life, and with the proviso of freedom to choose. And so we'll talk about what all that means in the course of time. So again, reminding you of the way big picture, we've looked at the way that 1 Corinthians 7 is broken up. Verses 1 to 7 were a discussion about, you've heard it said it's good for a man not to touch a woman, and he spends the next 4 verses saying that's nuts, that's wrong, that's not what God's called you to do. So you get the idea that there was a slogan, much as we saw in chapter 6, that he was addressing, and that's what the first 7 verses are, but they were towards the married. Verses 10 and 11 were about the married as well. Verses 8 and 9, we're talking about unmarried or divorced and the widowed. 12 to 24, which we looked at last week, what happens when someone's married as a believer to an unbeliever, and what we do there. And this week is the last part of talking about virgins, people who've never been married. Let's see. So again, we're going to look at the never been married, and then not an issue here in the 1 Corinthians passage. This was not known in that time, or at least not discussed. But after we look at, what do we do about abuse in the context of all these things, we'll look at that next week. So you might be praying for me. All right, so let's look at the text. L.P. Hartley said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And one of the difficulties we have in any Bible interpretation is to say, what is life like now? And then to go back, what was life like in the first century? And you go, nothing is like this at all. This is not like that. And so when we got even our words of abuse and things like that, we'll talk about next week. The word abuse didn't appear in a Bible translation until something around 1995 or 1997. Now, there are plenty of biblical words that talk about the same thing. Oppression is the one that comes to mind. But our English word of abuse doesn't appear as a literal concept in the translation. That doesn't mean it's not there, we can't address it, but we have to be careful of taking our world and foisting it back on their world and then trying to mean something. We do it exactly the opposite. What does their world mean? What are the overarching principles that they gathered out of it? What are the principles that translate to our world, and how do we then live? Or how then do we live? If I'm quoting a Francis Schaeffer book. So the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Always when you're going back to do Bible interpretation, just remember that. Don't take this world into that. Don't say, well, what's in this for me? Because the Bible is not about you, as Tim Keller reminds us well. So an overarching theme in this entire chapter is stay as you are when Christ found you. If you're married, stay married. If you're divorced, you might think about staying single. If you're widowed, you might think about staying single. If you're married to an unbeliever, you might think about staying married if you can both agree. If you can't agree, the Lord brings us peace, and go ahead and let that person go. But it's stay as you are, don't seek to change. And that's the kind of the overarching theme. What do you think the theme is going to be today? That indeed might be the theme, but not today. It's yeah. To your, I mean, jokingly, I know you're saying, but it's we want to understand that the Bible's telling us, and Paul's telling us that don't look to make changes in terms of how you are when Christ found you. So we looked at the four groups so far. We've touched on this before: the married or divorced, the widows, the married who are both believers, and then the married who are a believer to an unbeliever. And now we're going to look today a fifth category of the never been married. So let's turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses, we're going to start at verse 25. And the title of this section would be Stay Unmarried, One, because of the present crisis. What's that mean? So let's read together. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I'm offering direction as one who, by the mercy of the Lord, is trustworthy. I think then that this is a good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Again, this is the theme that we've heard now for the fourth or fifth time. It's good for a man to remain as he is. And are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such people as yourselves will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. So, the first phrase he comes across is the idea of virgin. And here it's the Greek word parthenos. Here are the words and their meanings. The Greek word parthenos, and it's one who's never been engaged in sexual intercourse, one who's virgin or a chaste person. And you kind of get that idea, but some commentators say, well, that's in the feminine here, or it's kind of neutral, but we understand this pronoun is the word can apply to both male and female. And you're giving the idea that he's addressing people who've never been married, whether male or female, and saying, essentially, he's going to say it's not wrong to marry, but it might go well with you in view of the present distress to stay unmarried. Again, when we say present distress, think of the world that Bob just laid out, where persecution was beginning even already. And it was difficult. Again, this is the first century. Paul would leave Corinth on his second missionary journey. At the end of it, he'd leave Corinth after writing 2 Corinthians. He'd leave here and go into Jerusalem and be taken captive in the temple, and he'd be held in prison for 2 years in Caesarea. And remember, the persecution already started there. So Paul's not unaware of the difficulties that had, and they were looking to capture, of course, leaders. So this present distress was already impacting Paul, and Paul knew it was going to impact him as well. So that's the idea that present distress is an oppression inherent in the nature of things. Now, the book of Acts, Agabus prophesies about a coming famine, but that was a little bit earlier, 45 to 48 AD. Paul's writing this in 1 Corinthians about 51, 52 AD or so. And in 2 Corinthians about 5 years after that. And Romans is written while he's at Corinth, delivering the 2 Corinthians letter, or following up on the 2 Corinthians letter. So the things that we see in Romans and 2 Corinthians are much later. So we don't know exactly the present distress, but you can get an idea that the difficulty is rising up and it's pressing in upon everybody's conscience. The thing that Paul says here is, he says, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion. That opinion isn't really the best notion here, and that what he's saying is Jesus didn't talk specifically about this, But as we look at the principles that Jesus taught us, or we know from the Old Testament, he's saying this probably is the wise course of treatment. But notice what he's doing. He's not saying legalistically, I'm an apostle, it's my opinion, therefore stop it. Stop this marriage thing. He's saying, but if you do marry, you do not what? Sin. And so he's giving the freedom to say, if you don't have the gift of celibacy, if you don't have the gift of singleness, stay single and don't marry. That's okay. But if you do marry because you don't have that gift, that's okay too. So he's given the overarching thing. It's good to remain where you are, but if you're not equipped, you don't have the gift of singleness, go ahead and get married with a free conscience, right? And be happy in the Lord for that. So again, the idea of opinion is not just a personal preference, but a weighted judgment from a qualified source. Again, he's looking at scriptural principles for all of this. And as I mentioned, the idea of distress, present distress, is something brought about by the nature of things, a pressure or a necessity of some kind. And again, this is Bob, I think, just did an excellent job of bringing the prequel to my. I know he had that in mind. He always to be the prequel to my discussion today. But again, that's the idea that's there. It's in view of the present arising of difficulty. Now, Paul didn't have a crystal ball. He didn't know when the end times are coming. He's trying to read the signs like just you and I would, of saying here's the difficulty and rise in things, and it's coming upon us. Another word that's used is the idea of good, something that's pleasurable or pleasant, desirable, and advantageous. But one of the things he talks about here, when he says, let me get back to my bet. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I am offering up direction or an opinion, other versions have it, as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. I think then it's good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. And the idea of good then is something that's advantageous. You'll find less stress that if you're having to flee because of your present distress, it's going to be easier to carry one of you across the border, so to speak, than two. It's easier for you to care about where food's coming from for you or money's coming from for you rather than you for your entire family. So that's the idea of good that he's talking about. But then he says, again, it's good for man to remain as he is. Does that catch anybody's attention? Like he's just talking to the men as if they're the only ones who have opinions and problems. But the idea is not man as a gender or a sex. He's talking about mankind here, right? It's good for mankind to marry. And the phrase here is often used in contrast to created things like animals and plants. So when the new SB, the NASB says remain as he is, the he's implied, but there's no literal he there. Right? So the translation is just trying to make it smooth, which is really odd for New American Standard. That's not what it's known for, is a smooth translation. But it's trying to make it smooth for the reader to be able to interpret. But what he's saying is, whatever state you find yourself in, remain there. It's good for mankind not to be married, to remain as you are, is really the idea that's there. Again, finally, then the word release. Now, the word's attested to in the papyri as a technical term for releasing a person from the contract constraints of a contract. But Paul uses this term. He brings it over from the business language, business world, to here and says he uses the term that can apply to both married couples, where the term would mean to divorce, and to engaged couples, where it would mean the idea of breaking a contract. So again, remember that he's talking to the Corinthians, and they were predominantly a Jewish or a Gentile congregation. That's your pop quiz for the day. Gentile. He's not talking about so much the idea of engagement where you considered, as soon as you were engaged, you were considered married and you had to get a divorce to break the contract of betrothal. He's not talking about that kind of world. But the Gentiles, the Romans and Greeks, did know of the idea of betrothals and engagements, and that it was a serious thing, but you could break out of it. The other thing not to remember is that in the context of marriage here, and the thought that I was going to have just went that way. I'll come back to it. Can't remember it. All right. But now let's look at again, back at the passage. Verse 28, but if you marry, you've not sinned. If a virgin marries, she has not sinned, but yet such people as yourselves will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. But I say this, brothers, the time has been shortened, so that now, from now on, those who had wives should be as though they had none. So in verse 27, the idea of seek not a wife if you're released or unmarried, and if you have not sinned, if you do marry. As above, Paul recognizes the recent present circumstances. It may not be best to marry. And this is especially given the Old Testament commands to be fruitful, multiply, fill and subdue, right? It's hard to do that unmarried. But in terms of gift of singleness, he's saying there are aspects you can do God's work and God's will without being married. And you've not sinned if you don't get married, and you've not sinned if you do get married because of the present distress and present circumstances. The pressure's off, given the world that we live in. At the same time, if being unmarried yields temptations that are unbearable, if you don't have the gift of celibacy or singleness, then marry, and you have not sinned. That last caution and the reminder that he gives is that marriage will bring more trouble given the present circumstances. Again, given all the trouble that we have in this life, again, this is almost really the fulfillment. Paul's words are almost the fulfillment of the thing that he's saying as a fulfillment of Jesus's words. So it's started already, and we're just 30 years into Christianity by this point. So let's stop there. Any questions? Good. Keep it that way, and we'll be happy. All right. So the next section, stay unmarried. One or it's two because of the end of the world. Again, this touches on the things we were just looking at. But I say this, brothers, the time has been shortened, so that now, from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make any full use of it. For the present form of this world is passing away. Again, you see Paul talking about Peter has, I don't think has been written yet, but he's borrowing words that seem like they come from Peter and Jesus, and saying the world we see it is coming to an end. We don't know when that's going to be, but it's distressing to see this all come to a conclusion. Again, when he says, I say this, brothers, he's addressing everybody now, brothers and sisters. He's addressing all of the church. He also says the idea of being shortened. Well, that's the same phrase. That's how you'll ignore that. The idea, he starts off with the idea of shortened. To draw, let's see, yeah, to shorten means to draw together so as to have less time. To put a limit on it, or you can, just a shorter word is to soon. Like the end times is sooner than it used to be. Now, we're 2,000 years past that. So when is soon? It's still soon. It's sooner than it was when the world began. Paul's concern, though, is not with the amount of time they have left, but with a radical new perspective of the foreshortened future that gives one with regard to the present age. This goes back to the idea of present distress. We've got trouble now. The trouble will continue to increase. I think the biggest thing that Bob brought up is the idea of, the earth is going to continue to have trouble. Romans 8 brings us out, 22 and 23. That there'll be an increase in the earth groans for its redemption. And the number of earthquakes in the first 10 years of the millennium that we have, 18,000 earthquakes, I think he said. And then the second decade, 84,000 earthquakes. Gives you an idea that there's an increasing amount of distress that the earth is going through. And that's the idea that even Paul in his day and age is addressing. As he looks on the horizon, the current events, the prophecies of Jesus, he reasons this could be soon, which is something that we all should do. We should all keep short accounts with the Lord, because the day is far, the time is far spent. The day is close at hand. The day is drawing conclusion. So Paul's concern here is not to be encumbered with the cares of this world or the cares of another person or even a family. Wherever you find yourself, stay there. Yeah, Dave. That blank? Yeah. All right. Which brings us now to the next section. Number 3, stay unmarried because of the distractions of married life, which may seem like he's repeating himself, but he's just continuing to give time after time. Because what word starts off, where'd it go? It's in my head. Don't say anything or I'll lose it. Verse 29 of 1 Corinthians 7. What's the first word there? What or but? Yeah. Right? What's the first word in verse 32? But. What do you think the first word in verse 36 is going to be? But. So the idea of he's continuing to make these drilling down arguments in terms of the logic. He's trying to persuade you with the reason and the rationale for the reason to stay married. So he's not trying to repeat himself as so much as continuing to make persuasive arguments that this is a reason to stay unmarried. Stay as you are when Jesus found you. So again, we're in verse 32. But I want you to be, let's see, but I want you to be free from a concern. One who's unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But the one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests are divided. The woman who's unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, and that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who's married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put a restraint on you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. So again, as we start off with the word but, it means, again, we have a new section and a new argument to build in persuasion of the reason to stay as you are. Paul takes his recommendation that single men and women remain unmarried a step further. So quoting from a guy named Ray Chiampa, which I've been quoting from frequently, the argument moves from the mundane and practical in verses 25 to 28, meaning he's talking about the present crisis and troubles in this life. And then in verses 29 to 31, he's talking about the eschatological view, the view of end times and things to come. Now he moves off to a different world called the Christological. The third point, which makes explicit this, underlies the first truth, namely that Paul wants the Corinthians to live lives of undistraction devoted to the Lord. It's not so much as life could be really trouble if you got more people to worry about in this life. Life could be trouble thinking about that we don't have as much time as we used to. But what he's saying now in this third argument, which is not saying the same thing, it's a third argument of a different kind saying, but you should be devoted to the Lord to begin with. Now, it's not that you can't be devoted to the Lord being married, but he's just saying it's easier to be devoted to the Lord when you don't have to be devoted to your wife first, which is where your priorities should be. Paul is being very pastoral here. He wants his people not to be anxious, not to be overly concerned about the circumstances and the distractions that face them from being wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord. It's not a preference, nor is it legalism. It's just wisdom born from experience. And again, this comes into play, right? We have the Spirit of God helping us interpret, and the Spirit helps us remember these principles. Paul does not intend to eliminate care as if humans could achieve this state of being carefree, but to reorient it so that to reorient that care so that a person is not torn apart by futile distress over things such as material security. If you're having to worry about your 401k and again, this is modern day principle, but if you're having to worry about 401k or where the food's coming from, rather than can I be devoted to the Lord and serving God's people in the midst of the present distress we're in, given all the challenges that we have even from government, it's better to remain single if that's where God has found you. So now you see this third argument. Again, just thinking through them. The first one was practical, this present crisis, the troubles in life. The second one was eschatological, the time is short. And then the third one is Christological. So three different arguments. Paul's trying to make his point. He's trying to be persuasive about this. Right, that brings us now to verses 36 to 38. And that's the same words again. Same words one more time. Okay, so now the fourth point, which is the final point of this advice to unmarrieds and never been married, I should say. Stay unmarried with the proviso of the freedom to choose, which hopefully makes sense to you. But if anyone thinks he is acting dishonorably toward his virgin, if she has passed her youth and it ought to be so, let him do as he wishes. He is not sinning, let them marry. But the one who stands firm in his heart, if he is not under constraint, but has authority over his own will, and he's decided in his own heart to keep his own virgin, he will do well. So then, both the one who gives his own virgin in marriage does well, and the one who does not give her in marriage will do better. Now, everybody should have one single eyebrow going, what the what? I saw it on Gale, first of all, and I know the rest of you, I was a bit, it's like, what is he talking about? This is confusing, yes? All right. So this is one of those verses. 1 Corinthians 7 is wrought with difficulties in translation. I mentioned it 2 weeks ago that it's probably the most difficult. This is probably number 2 in all of the Pauline corpus, going, what is he talking about? So another quote that will do well to remember is, as one commentator put it, reading other people's mail is confusing. Again, this is one of the hardest verses of Paul to interpret, hardest sections. Again, I say this even in light of what I talked about a couple weeks ago. There are gaps in our understanding, in language, in culture, in practice. So what we do know is that this really, verse 36 really is, can you see that okay? This really is the key to the passage. But if anyone thinks he's acting dishonorably toward his virgin, if she is past her youth and it ought to be so, let him do what he wishes. He's not sinning, let them marry. What we do know is that most first marriages were arranged. Whether it's Jew or Greek, Roman, Gentile, they were still arranged marriages for the first marriage. There's no thought of entering into marriage covenant or of a covenant of betrothal by oneself. This is not something you did. Again, one was eligible to be married really as soon as one went through menstruation, which happened a little bit later back then, but probably at the age of 12 or 13, you were eligible to be married. Which of you were ready for marriage at the age of 12 or 13? But that was common practice back then. So again, your parents or at least your father would go ahead and do that. Again, we sometimes can bring our idea of marriage that, well, what did she have to say about it? Didn't she have anything to say about it? And your response should be, this is not a Disney movie, let it go. We don't bring the present into the past and try to say our values as a culture, 2,000 years removed, are their values as a culture. That's just the way they did things back then. They arranged them. The second thing, as we examine this section of scripture, there's some odd phrases to our Western ear, like acting dishonorably, like, and his virgin, and past her youth. Every Bible translator has to take a stance. I read this already, but reading other people's email can be confusing. There are some phrases that are difficult to understand. Every Bible translator has to take a stance. They don't get the luxury, like me, of punting and say, I don't know. They have to put in words in that section of the. They just don't bring Greek over and say, you can read Greek, you'll figure it out yourself. They translate it into English the best they can with the manuscripts and the people who are doing the translation work. To that end, here's you can sort of read that. What I have is the New American Standard, the New English Bible, and the New Revised Standard Version. Now, just a side version, everybody knows that how many of you have ESV? Do you know that the ESV came from the Revised Standard? So it's really called the Revised Standard, or the New Revised Standard. But this is the New Revised Standard is a parallel to the ESV. There's not the same thing. So it's but you can think of the ESV as the Revised Standard. And each of them have different interpretations. The NASB, but if any man thinks he's acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, and this is the 1995 version of the NASB, if she should be of full age, if it must be so, let him do what she wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. The New English Bible, but if a man has a partner in celibacy and feels that he's not behaving properly towards her, if that is his instincts are too strong for him, and something must be done, he may do as he pleases. There's nothing wrong with it. Let them marry. And the New Revised Standard, if anyone thinks he's not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong, and so it has to be, let him be marry as he wishes. It's no sin, let them marry. Wow. Do you see the three different radical interpretations and three different meanings you can get from all that? And this is just three interpretations. Now, these are the common three. But in the first view, I know my time is short. In the first view, represented by the New American Standard, it understands a situation where a father is faced with a decision whether to marry off his virgin daughter or not. All right, so let's just leave that one there. That's pretty much straightforward. The second one is the idea of couples who are living in a, quote, spiritual marriage. What that means, no idea. They've committed themselves to a relationship without sexual relations, but it places too great a strain on their sexual desires. And so they should just go ahead and get married. That's kind of the idea that's there. And then the third view, which is coming again from the New Revised Standard Version, um, is probably the most likely represent. Well, it understands that Paul to be addressing Christians engaged to be married. Um, and if anyone is, it refers to the fiance, and the virgin is his. Hmm, if anyone is referring to the male engaged, and then his virgin is the female engaged, which reveals that Paul expected chastity before marriage. And the term may designate what's important about her. The two are bound by betrothal, but wonder if they should follow through on their marriage. So first version and the second version are somewhat near related. It puts the NASB puts it as it's the father and the virgin daughter. The third version, which is probably even more likely, is the two couples that are engaged and they're just wondering if they should follow through on it. Everybody clear that you got really those two major, the other one middle? No idea. All right, let me stop there. We got not too much time, but questions? Yeah.
So would you hold to the ESV on this? As far as this is two individuals who are not married, contemplating getting married, but then have decided to put off that marriage in light of the present distress.
Yeah, I would not say they put it off yet, but they're wondering about whether they should put it off yet or not. Yeah, yeah. I think it follows the third one more likely. Yeah.
I was looking at MacArthur. MacArthur actually takes in his commentary, actually takes the first one, that this is a father regarding his.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I don't know that introducing the father all of a sudden, when we've never talked about parents at all in its whole entire chapter, introducing the parents doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Now, the other side is parents and fathers were more responsible for making many of the decisions about marriage. So again, this is going to be an arranged marriage, not two people who went off and said, let's elope like we saw in Pocahontas. I have no idea if they eloped in Pocahontas or not. I didn't see Pocahontas, so just picking a movie. But I think that's probably the version. Yeah.
I just wondered, again, virgin daughter, is that in the text?
It's not.
It's not.
No.
So that some translator just came up with that idea that, well, maybe that's what he's talking about.
Well, every interpreter just comes up with the idea that that's what they're talking about. I mean, I'm not trying to pull your chain, but that's literally what the interpreter's job is to do, is to give us an idea of this is what we think the sense is. You see, in the New American Standard, one of the things it does really well is it has the word daughter in italics. The idea of italics is they're trying to send the signal. This is not in the original, but this is what we think the sense is. Right? Yeah. So it's their best sense, and it's trying to be making sure it coheres. The problem is I don't think it coheres. I don't think it goes with the whole passage. So
I mean, that just puts the whole thing that it's a father overseeing his daughter,
right,
according to NASB.
right, yeah. Dave?
So what is the, how, like, for example, why is it that they believe that though? Is it like you said, it feels like the context or there's some context for it to be that?
I do not know what's in the mind of MacArthur.
I think, and this is the ESV that I have, but I think the commentary that he has here is coming off of the NAS, which I think is what he originally did, his commentary.
He did his sermons on NASB. He did his first commentary on the New King James, and then it was over to something else. NASB, because of licensing, was one of the last. Believe it or not.
Well, the NAS 77 or the 95, because the 95 is the one that got rid of all the these and thous.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember. I don't remember what gave that message. So, yeah.
It's a kind of a name, but wasn't the betrothal period could be a lengthy time, like years even? So let's say a young daughter was betrothed at 12, but she might not be getting married till
I think-
16 or
I
something.
think the betrothal would have been done even before she got marriageable age, but then the marriage would be consummated at 12 or 13. So yeah, it might have been a long betrothal, but she might have been committed to the marriage at 7 or 5 or 8, but not married till 12 or 13. So it was the long way the other way. Yeah. All right. So again, the whole idea here is following up on the word dishonorably. Did I? Yeah. And I know I'm 4 minutes over time. The idea of dishonorable here means disgrace by virtue of circumstances outside of standards or cultural norms. In other words, Paul's a little bit concerned of, well, he's trying to allay the concern of, don't worry if this is out of cultural norms for there to be an engagement and then it stop. Don't worry if it's outside of cultural norms for you to make an agreement to get your daughter married and to say, no, that's not going to work for me now. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about whether it's dishonorable for you or not. Worry about, is there going to be a concern? Can she live for the Lord? Can he live for the Lord? Can they live for the Lord? So the application actually works no matter which interpretation you have. Don't worry about the cultural norms, but worry about can you walk with the Lord? Can you please the Lord given the present circumstance? Don't worry about whether she's past her marriageable age. I mean, maybe she didn't get engaged at 5 or 7. Maybe she's 14 or 15. She's an old maid. Hopefully you took the sneer as being sarcasm. Sarcasm is my love language. She's past her youth. That's not really relevant. Don't worry about the cultural norms. Worry about, can you please the Lord or not? That's the thing we want to kind of talk away. Again, let me wind up here. Part of the thing Paul's trying to say in this entire chapter is being content. Whether it's being content even if you're married to an unbeliever, to be content if you're married to a believer, to be content if you're single, to be content if you desire to be married. Be content in that. Contentment seems to be the concept about this passage. Don't be anxious about your circumstances, whether you're married or not, whether engaged or not. Stay where you are when Jesus found you. But if you marry, and Paul includes this explicitly, you have not sinned if you don't have the gift of singleness and wish to marry. Now, again, thinking about next week, as I mentioned before, social concerns about abuse can color our interpretation of these passages. Rather than bypass those concerns, I lost my place. Rather than bypass those concerns, I want to address them in the context of what abuse means for marriages, for separation, for divorce, and remarriage. What is abuse if no translation has the word abuse in it until the late 1990s? What kinds of abuse are there? What are the distinctions 21st century? Are the distinctions 21st century only? Just part of the hashtag Me Too movement? Or are these talked about in the Bible as well? So we'll take a look at those and do a quick overview of those distinctions and what they mean for us. So again, that's not the answer everybody will want to hear necessarily, but this is what we got to go by what the scriptures have to say. And what's important is we've got to be not concerned about what the culture tells us. This is kind of underarching theme here. We can't be worried about, well, what will people think of us if we don't use the right words? Paul's telling us here, that's not our concern. Our concern is, am I walking with the Lord? Am I serving the Lord? Am I honoring the Lord with what I do? And those, again, we're not looking at individual interpretations, but what do these mean for us? The principles for us to live in. So again, we'll tackle that next week. You might pray for me. I have an idea of what I'm going to. I know what I'm going to say. Now it's just a question of how do I bring that to fruition that says that in a way that's honoring. So let's close in prayer. Father, again, thank you for everybody's patience today as we walk through this. I know we got a late start today, just due to some technology issues. But Father, we just thank you again for your word and the comfort it is to us that when we're walking in the Spirit, these decisions become so much more easy to bear. We see that people from Corinth are asking Paul questions about, can we marry if we're engaged? And we see the present circumstances. We don't want to be in that kind of distress. Is it okay to postpone the marriage? And you've given freedom there. But if we can't be single, Father, you've given freedom there as well. And we do thank you again for your Spirit and how it brings wisdom to us. Lord, we want to study your word, to know you, and to be known by you, and to imitate you. So be with us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.